Oh, hi, everyone. As you can see, my background is a little different today. I recently moved to a new space. It's a far bigger space. I'm really excited to put this all together, but for now, it's going to look like a bit of a mess. And as you watch my videos, I'm sure you'll slowly watch this room evolve. But today, I would like to discuss Dragon Age The Veilguard and what EA had to say about why this game ultimately bombed. You would think they would learn the lessons that should have been applied, but of course, executives have no idea what they're talking about. They seldom have really earned their jobs and the salary that they intake. It just makes no sense that they're in the position that they are when they know so little about things like, hey, why did our product fail? So, Dragon Age The Veilguard, as many of you may know, ultimately really did not meet expectations at all, with the game having engaged approximately 1.5 million players during the quarter, down nearly 50% from the company's expectations. And the fact that they used the word engaged is significant because it doesn't mean that this game sold 1.5 million units, but rather that 1.5 million players checked the game out through things like the free trial and whatnot. And so the terminology there is very important in terms of units sold. It's probably potentially significantly less than 1.5 million, which is a far cry from even the worst selling entry in past Dragon Age games. So this was a major flop for EA, especially given how long this game was in development, given all of the trials and tribulations that were involved in shipping this game. And it may very well have killed Dragon Age. One of the developers did come out and say that Dragon Age isn't dead because it's yours now. But as I mentioned before, that kind of reads like a eulogy, like this dead thing isn't really dead because it lives in our hearts kind of a thing, but it doesn't exist in the physical realm anymore, at least for now. Who knows, maybe they'll revive it down the line, but that seems less likely, especially if BioWare doesn't knock it out of the park with Mass Effect 5 and make headways when it comes to, bringing EA money, because that's ultimately what they're aiming for. And along the way, we have seen a round of layoffs within BioWare that indicates that EA is starting to clean house and that they're losing their patience with BioWare. I'm almost wondering if they'll get to ship Mass Effect 5. At best, that's their absolute last chance. Jason Try kind of highlighted how it's a miracle that Dragon Age The Veilguard even shipped at all in the state that it did, because EA mandated this game to be a live service before the project was rebooted into a more single-player focused experience. And so the fact that they were able to make that shift and transition and reverse course and still ship a product that worked, that within itself is miraculous. And a lot of why this project suffered had to do with EA's early mandates. And so now the developers are the one who gets to get laid off and get scapegoated for this. Now, speaking of that transition from single player to live service, this ties into what EA CEO Andrew Wilson had to say about Dragon Age The Veilguard's performance, why he believes it flopped, and what he thinks the future of the company should be in terms of the direction that their games should head into. So speaking to investors in a call recently, in a financial call, this is a quote that IGN picked out that is very relevant and that could spell just really unfortunate tidings for future EA titles. Here's what Andrew Wilson had to say. In order to break out beyond the core audience, games need to directly connect to the evolving demands of players who increasingly seek shared world features and deeper engagements alongside high-quality narratives in this beloved category. Dragon Age had a high-quality launch and was well-reviewed by critics and those who played. However, it did not resonate with a broad enough audience in this highly competitive market. They're back to spouting the same bullshit that they have spouted in the past about how single-player experiences are dying, what players want is live services, and so the ideal future for gaming is if everything was live services. That's kind of what's being said here. Evolving demands of players who increasingly seek shared world features. The suggestion being that we're all moving away and distancing ourselves from single player games, that we no longer like those, and that we demand more live services, which is just woefully untrue. And that has been proven time and again by numerous non-live service releases that have gone on to break records time and again. In the same call with investors, another EA executive, Chief Financial Officer Stuart Canfield, had something similar to say about Dragon Age The Veilguard, its underperformance, and what that means for the landscape of gaming. He said Dragon Age The Veilguard underperformed, icing the competitive dynamics of the single-player RPG market. Historically, blockbuster storytelling has been the primary way our industry bought beloved IP to the players. The game's financial performance highlights the evolving industry landscape and reinforces the importance of our actions to reallocate resources towards our most significant and highest potential opportunities, referring to share world experiences to live services. Except you already tried that before. Do you remember Anthem at all? Which also came from BioWare, by the way. You tried to push this studio that is traditionally known for single-player RPG experiences, expansive narrative campaign-driven experiences, tried to have them tackle live services, which is a genre that they were unfamiliar with, that they were just not experienced enough with. And guess what happened? It just completely bombed. It launched in an unacceptable state. The ideas behind it were interesting and there was potential there, but development was woefully troubled. They only really started building the game in the last year and a half of this 6 years long development cycle. It was a disaster for EA and BioWare. And so you want to just go back to that? Not to mention all of the live services that have been shutting down and flopping left and right in recent years. I mean, you've got Marvel's Avengers, which has the Avengers name behind it, one of the most recognizable IPs in the world. You have a game like that flopping. You've got Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, which featured the entire Justice League alongside the Suicide Squad. That recently shut down because it's so woefully underperformed, because the live service component felt so shoved into an experience where it didn't feel like live service belonged. Recently, Multiverses shut down. That is essentially the Warner Brothers Super Smash Brothers that feature some of the biggest IPs, some of the most recognizable IPs in the world, all kind of coming together in one game. Even that, with all of those recognizable IPs, wasn't enough to save that game from doom. And then Concord, I mean, Sony thought that was going to be their billion-dollar IP, their Star Wars, and it didn't even sell 1 million units, and it did so poorly that they shut the game down 2 weeks after launch, and they made $0 from it after spending hundreds of millions of dollars, so on and so forth. The list just goes on. And I mean, that was a flop so bad that Sony has started to see that just putting all of their eggs in the live service basket was just an awful idea. And so they recently shut down a bunch of live services behind the scenes that they were working on. And then on the other hand, you've got evidence of so many non-live service games that have gone on to do gangbusters, to succeed and sell in a way that any AAA publisher would love. Baldur's Gate 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Elden Ring, Palworld, Black Myth Wukong. Look at those numbers and tell me that these experiences are no longer as highly demanded, that the landscape is evolving in such a way where these experiences are no longer wanted. It's just a whole lot of nonsense what the EA executives are saying. Dragon Age The Veilguard didn't fail because it wasn't a live service. Even if that game had shipped as a live service, I guarantee you, with the direction that it went for, it ultimately would have failed. The issue with Dragon Age The Veilguard was that it didn't appeal to anybody because it had the name Dragon Age in it, but the direction that it went for with its art style, its aesthetic, its tone and atmosphere, and then just the writing not being quite there, and the combat system not being quite what Dragon Age fans were used to. It didn't appeal to Dragon Age fans, and it just didn't appeal to a broader audience. And so the end result is that you got a game that just really didn't feel like Dragon Age, that people really didn't feel excited about, and that had enough flaws in its numerous systems and was diluted enough in its RPG elements and the aspects that make Dragon Age that it just didn't resonate with people. And so making it a live service wouldn't have mitigated that under the direction that this game was made in. If anything, it might have suffered a greater financial loss because making a live service is just more expensive, and you have to have certain infrastructures for keeping this online game online. And so it would have been this endeavor that probably would have ultimately gone down the Anthem path. It's crazy the vicious cycle that these companies go through of going back to old methods that have clearly failed. I don't know how any CEO can look at the current landscape of live services and the ratio of successes versus failures, with failures encompassing the vast majority of live service releases. I don't know how they can look at that landscape and say we should focus on live services, and clearly live service is the solution to all our problems. Any failure on the single player front is because it wasn't a live service and not because of all these other reasons, when you've got all these other single player games succeeding that highlight that single player games are far from dead, that the demand for single player games or for non-live service experiences is extremely high, if not higher than those of live services, because that genre has become so oversaturated and has become so exploitative. And it just, people like an experience that has a beginning, middle, and end, and not something that has to go on forever, that feels like a part-time job, one that, often aims to exploit players through psychologically manipulative monetization tactics and FOMO elements. People just want to lose themselves in a world and play a game that was made to be purely fun and to have players escape. Even former BioWare developers were baffled that EA CEO would suggest such a dumbass, ridiculous notion. Right here we have Mike Laidlaw, who was the former creative director of Dragon Age. He tweeted, or he on Blue Sky posted the following: "Look, I'm not a fancy CEO guy, but if someone said to me the key to this successful single-player IP success is to make it purely a multiplayer game, no, not a spin-off, fundamentally change the DNA of what people loved about the core game, to me, I'd probably quit the job or something." Mike Laidlaw just didn't pull any punches because, the reasoning is just really that dumb, stupid, and ridiculous. He continued, just thinking out loud, of course, who'd be silly enough to demand something like that? Twice referring to Anthem. Has EA learned nothing from that? Next, we got David Gator, who was the lead writer and also the creator of the setting of Dragon Age. He posted the following: "Maybe I'm being unkind. There are certainly all sorts of lessons a company could learn from a game like Veilguard and it failing. I still haven't played it, so I'm going off of what other people have said. But maybe it should have been a live service. Being the takeaway seems a bit short-sighted and self-serving. My advice to EA, not that they care, you have an IP that a lot of people love deeply. At its height, it sold well enough to make you happy, right? Look at what it did best at the point where it sold the most. Follow Larian's lead and double down on that. The audience is still there and waiting. Thank you. I couldn't have put it better myself." Why is Dragon Age Origins so beloved among fans? Why did Dragon Age Inquisition go on to sell 12 million units in its lifespan? Look into that instead of going, well, everything has to be a live service because herpy derp. I don't even know the reasoning behind why they think this way when they themselves have failed with this attempt at trying to get BioWare to ship a live service. What this is confirmation bias. EA is dead set on believing that live services are the way of the future, and not because they genuinely believe that that's what's best for gaming as a whole, but because they know that's the most profitable venture. So they have to justify every non-live service failure as it being because it wasn't a live service, while ignoring all the evidence suggesting that the high demand for single-player experiences or for non-live service experiences, that all of that still exists at an all-time high. Some of the highest numbers we've seen on Steam ever, guess what, are either single-player or non-live service experiences with multiplayer components in them, but are not that kind of share world thing that EA has an erection for. I get that Apex Legends was a huge success, but that was once in a blue moon. All those live services that end up being enough of a success to become those billion-dollar products, for those companies, those are so rare. You kind of have to win the lottery a little bit with that. Making the assumption that every live service can go on to do $1 billion and, that it won't be a waste of financial resources and manpower and time is a ridiculous notion, especially when the market of live services is more saturated than ever and people's times and money are limited and they can only engage with so many live services. And for you to get them to switch to your live service, you have to output a product that isn't just a generic trend chaser. You have to set a trend. You have to create something that is irresistible because there's nothing quite like that out there, or it's a better version of what already exists. What Dragon Age The Veilguard needed was better direction, better writing, And just, it needed to be more Dragon Age. It needed to have that DNA that it just kind of lost along the way. And that's ultimately why it didn't sell that well and why it didn't resonate with fans and the gaming community. That's really what it is. And if this is the mentality that EA has, I genuinely fear for Mass Effect 5 and whether that project will be rebooted into some bullshit live service that will be detrimental to the potential that that game has if BioWare can kind of pull it together and make a Mass Effect next-gen experience that, you know, kind of lights up the hype amongst sci-fi fans in the way that the original Mass Effect trilogy did. That's what they have to do. What did fans love about the original trilogy? And then, like, run with that. I would not be shocked if EA mandated BioWare to make Mass Effect 5 into some kind of live service or to include live service elements, which would compromise the experience, because the DNA of Mass Effect, the DNA of Dragon Age, the DNA of BioWare is not live service. And so EA has to steer away from that notion, but instead they're doubling down on this thing that more often than not leads to demise and failure and financial losses. So I just wanted to share this with you guys. The stupidity and the lack of long-term thinking of CEOs continues to baffle me. Look at what Larian did right. Look at what CD Projekt did right. Look at what all these major successes in the non-live service landscape did right, why those were successful in that way, and like go in that direction. Just because their single-player game failed, it must mean that the whole population just doesn't like single-player games. That's just not how it works. Make something that is as compelling as your Elden Rings and as your Baldur's Gate 3s and as your Cyberpunk 2077s and your Witchers and whatnot. Make something of that caliber and people will flock to your product, whether it's live service or not. So that's my take. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.